Welcome to InfoSec Bytes, your go-to podcast for bite-sized insights on information security, AI, cloud, quantum, and cybersecurity incident root cause analysis. With over 100 episodes, we've got you covered on the latest trends and tips. Like, subscribe, and share to join the conversation and stay secure. Okay, let's unpack this. We have a stack of extremely detailed, highly technical postmortems and analyst reports right here. And today, we are diving deep into what is, well, arguably the most consequential cloud failure of the decade. The AWS outage, the one that started in US-EAST-1 back in October 2025. And yeah, this wasn't just a brief server hiccup, was it? It was more like a 15-hour systemic crisis, a global shockwave, really, that proved just how reliant, maybe too reliant, the entire modern economy is on, a few core DNS records sitting in Northern Virginia. So our mission today is critical. We're zeroing in on the cybersecurity root cause analysis, moving past just the symptoms to really understand how a single specific software bug in DynamoDB's DNS management of all things could just escalate, how it could spiral into this worldwide paralysis, hitting everything from high-frequency trading APIs right down to, well, your smart thermostat.
It's fascinating, isn't it? What makes this deep dive so essential, I think, for anyone running mission-critical workloads is that this whole incident provides a perfect, maybe painfully perfect case study for systemic fragility. It just lays bare the critical reliance the entire internet has on these centralized cloud control planes. So for you, maybe you're the security architect or the senior engineer listening, the key question is really brutally simple. Why did AWS's built-in redundancy, the multi-availability zone architecture that you rely on every day, why did it fail so completely? And maybe more importantly, what does the fact that they needed manual operator intervention humans stepping in at 2.0 a.m.? What does that tell us about the current state of cloud automation? Kind of scary, really.
Definitely. Okay, let's get into section 1 then. The shockwave. Let's start with the timeline because, wow, it tells a story. It's a narrative of, immediate triage followed by the slow, agonizing system death, almost. The disruption kicked off late on October 19th, 2025, precisely 11:48 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. That's 07:11 GMT on October 20th for our international listeners. And initially, the warnings were pretty subtle, right? Just, increased error rates, a bit more latency for DynamoDB APIs and US-EAST-1. Nothing earth-shattering at first glance.
Right. And, we have to give credit where it's due here. The sources are pretty clear that AWS engineers jumped on it. They identified and mitigated the primary DNS issue itself with, well, frankly, tremendous speed. Within roughly 3 hours, so by 2.25 a.m. PDT or 10.11 GMP, the core fault was actually fixed. And they did this through manual operator intervention. Basically, humans had to step in, forcibly reroute internal resolvers, aggressively flush caching layers all across the region. That 3-hour window, that represents a highly efficient, high-stakes operational response. Good job there.
Absolutely. Props for the initial fix. But, and this is the huge, but here's where it gets really interesting. And this is the piece, I think, that turned what could have been a manageable incident into, well, a catastrophe. That 3-hour fix window. It was followed by a 15-hour systemic crawl towards recovery. 15 hours. Full system normalization wasn't even declared until approximately 3:01 p.m. PDT, so the following afternoon. That massive discrepancy, the primary fix was done, but the system stayed crippled for 15 more hours. That just screams fundamental failure of internal systemic resilience, doesn't it?
You absolutely hit the nail on the head there. That protracted recovery, it wasn't really about the original DNS bug anymore, not after those first 3 hours. The initial fix, yeah, it was successful in correcting the DNS record, but it seems the damage was already done to the regional control plane. It basically pushed the internal subsystems into what engineers call a metastable state. And honestly, that's the nightmare scenario for these huge distributed systems.
Okay, can you maybe elaborate on that metastable state? For our listeners, why is that condition so much worse than just, say, a simple hard failure, like a server just dying?
Yeah, good question. A simple hard failure is, well, it's obvious, right? Something breaks, it's offline, you maybe reboot it, you fail over, done. But a metatestable state, oh, that's insidious. It's a condition where the system is sort of stuck between two states. It's not fully failed, it's not offline, but it's definitely not functional either. It's characterized by this horrible feedback loop, what's called a self-sustaining congestive collapse. Basically, the system gets overwhelmed by its own attempts to repair itself. Think about it. Automated retries from millions, literally millions, of dependent services kick in. These are designed to handle brief network blips, transient failures.
But here, they suddenly just amplify the fault. They just flood the internal messaging queues, things like AWS's Simple Queue Service, SQS. They create these massive unmanageable backlogs. And this retry storm, it effectively becomes a denial of service attack against the region's own internal control plane. It prevents the region from processing configuration changes or, crucially, launching the very capacity it needs to absorb the failure and recover. So the system gets stuck in this loop. Failure leads to retries. Retries lead to more congestion and collapse, and that collapse prevents recovery. It just feeds on itself.
Wow, okay. And we can actually see this drawn-out recovery in the specific impact periods that are detailed in the sources, right? Like, the DynamoDB errors themselves, they were pretty constrained, less than 3 hours total, from 11:48 p.m. to 2:48 a.m. PDT. But the downstream consequences, they lasted way longer. The network load balancer connection errors NLB, that's a fundamental networking primitive. Those lasted from 5:30 a.m. right up until 2:09 p.m. PDT the next day. And maybe the most crippling failure, the one that really paralyzed things, the inability to launch new compute, EC2 launch failures, those spanned almost the entire 15-hour period, crippling the region until 1:50 p.m. PDT. It just shows how that initial DNS failure cascaded, didn't it? It crippled the region's ability to self-heal or even provision the new resources needed to fix itself.
Exactly. It's a chain reaction. And the sheer scale of this disruption, I mean, it really shocked analysts. Down Detector, which tracks these things, captured over 17 million user reports. That's across more than 60 countries. This single event, this October 2025 outage, it basically places it among the largest internet failures ever recorded. It just demonstrates starkly the near-total dependence we now have on the US-EAST-1 control plane for global application health.
And breaking down those numbers geographically really shows how global it was. Like you said, over 6.3 million reports in the US, sure. But then you see 1.5 million reports coming from the UK, 774,000 from Germany. This wasn't just a regional blip in North America. The logical fallout, the dependency was felt everywhere. Identity or configuration or critical metadata needed to talk back to Northern Virginia.
Yeah, and the source material really underlines just how deep AWS penetration is across, all sectors. The disruption hit 113 distinct AWS services. Think about that. And over 3,500 companies that Down Detector tracks were affected. We're talking massive consumer platforms, right? Snapchat saw something like 3 million user reports, Roblox, 716,000, not to mention things like the failure of core trading APIs for crypto services like Coinbase. And even Amazon's own retail site, Amazon.com, suffered significant degradation. They weren't immune.
Yeah, I found the examples related to critical infrastructure and the Internet of Things, IoT, particularly striking. We saw failures in smart home devices, things like Ring doorbells just not working. But my favorite sort of anecdotal piece from the sources, the one that makes this whole technical failure really visceral, was the inability of those 8 sleep smart beds. You know, the ones that adjust temperature. They couldn't adjust temperature or track sleep data because the database control plan for their APIs was unreachable in US-EAST-1. Just imagine waking up freezing or sweating, finding your critical comfort system is totally crippled by a DNS bug happening 3,000 miles away. That's something.
That is the perfect illustration, isn't it, of control plane dependency. And beyond just consumer tech, the incident immediately triggered severe political and regulatory scrutiny worldwide because critical national services just went dark. We saw UK banks like Lloyds, Halifax, major clearinghouses, even government sites like the UK's tax agency, HMRC, completely offline. The sources note this immediately escalated to the highest levels. It triggered the House of Commons Treasury Committee investigation into cloud resiliency and, critically, the classification of AWS as a critical third-party provider.
Right, and that completely shifts the conversation, doesn't it? It moves the failure out of the realm of just, IT downtime and squarely into the realm of national security risk. And when we talk about risk, we eventually have to talk money. Analyst estimates peg the total global economic loss conservatively somewhere between $2 billion and $5 billion with a B. They reference the 2021 AWS outage, which was estimated to cost customers around $100 million per hour. Well, this October 2025 event lasted 5 times longer in terms of that painful recovery time. So yeah, this wasn't just an IT failure. It was a systemic economic shock, one that's absolutely going to define cloud risk management strategies for the next decade, I think.
No question about it. The ripple effects are huge.
Okay, let's move into section 2 then, the technical breakdown. Why did the internet's phone book fail? Let's get into the weeds.
Right. So to truly grasp why this had such a massive global fallout, we have to pinpoint that single initial point of failure. And it was DynamoDB, specifically its DNS. Now, DynamoDB isn't just another database service for customers. Internally, inside AWS, it's a foundational primitive. It's used by something like 90% of internal AWS applications. They use it for critical state management, keeping track of sessions, even for authentication mechanisms via STS, the Security Token Service. So the specific issue centered on DNS resolution for the DynamoDB API endpoints in US-EAST-1. Basically, if DynamoDB's DNS fails there, the entire US-EAST-1 region essentially loses its memory. It can't find itself.
Okay, so the core function is translating dynamodb.us-east-1.amazonos.com into a working IP address that failed. But hang on, this is exactly the kind of failure that multi-layered automation is supposed to prevent, right? Eliminate single points of failure. Can you break down how that DNS management stack was supposed to work, the intended redundancy?
Absolutely. And the sources describe what sounds like, on paper, a highly redundant system. It involves two main independent automation components. First, you've got the DNS planner. Its job is to constantly monitor the health and capacity of the load balancers across all the availability zones, the AZs. Periodically, it generates a desired state, basically, a new DNS plan listing the healthy endpoints and their weights. Then second, you have the DNS enactor. This component takes that plan from the planner and applies it to Amazon Route 53, which is AWS's actual DNS service. It uses transactional logic to try and make sure the update is atomic. And crucially, this enactor operates redundantly across 3 separate availability zones. The idea is, if one enactor instance fails or gets stuck, the other 2 can still complete the update successfully.
Okay, that does sound pretty robust. 3-way redundancy across physically separate AZs. That should definitely negate a single point of failure. So how on earth did this highly resilient automation system end up, well, defeating itself?
Oh, it was a perfect storm, a classic latent concurrency bug. Specifically, a time of check to time of use, or to act to do failure. It's a nasty kind of race condition. To visualize it, maybe imagine 2 clerks, right? Let's call them Actor 1 and an Actor 2. They're both trying to update the same physical ledger that's Route 53 based on instruction sheets they received, plans A and B. Now, the sequence, as detailed meticulously in the AWS postmortem, went something like this. An initial enactor, let's say Enactor 1, started trying to apply an older plan, Plan A. But during this process, Enactor 1 encountered, and the report uses this phrase, unusually high delays. We don't know exactly why it got delayed, maybe network latency, maybe something else, but it was enough to stretch out its execution time significantly. So while Enactor 1 was stuck in this limbo trying to apply the old Plan A, the DNS planner doing its job generated a newer, correct, valid Plan B. And this newer Plan B was picked up by a different enactor instance, Enactor 2.
Okay, so Enactor 2 gets the good plan, Plan B, applies it successfully to Route 53, ensuring the correct DNS state. And then presumably it marks the old Plan A as stale, ready for garbage collection or invalidation. Everything looks normal so far, right?
Correct. Up to that point, the redundancy worked. Plan B went live. But here comes the killer concurrency failure. The delayed Enactor 1, the one stuck working on the old Plan A, it finally completed its original, very delayed execution of Plan A. And because the transactional logic, or perhaps the timeout associated with Plan A, hadn't fully expired or wasn't robust enough to detect the newer state, Enactor 1 successfully applied its outdated Plan A. It blindly overwrote the newer valid Plan B that Enactor 2 had just put in place. And Plan A, being structurally flawed or maybe incomplete due to its age or the circumstances under which it was generated, resulted in the publication of an empty DNS record for the primary regional endpoint, dynamodb.us-east-1.amazonos.com. The automation system, designed explicitly for self-healing and resilience, had instead poisoned its own critical configuration.
Wow, an empty record. So basically asking where's DynamoDB resulted in nowhere. And the sources are very clear on this next point. This inconsistent state, this poisoning, was so deeply embedded or unexpected that the automation stack itself couldn't recognize the failure condition. It couldn't attempt a rollback or self-correction. This required a human operator, a site reliability engineer, an SRE, probably woken up at some horrible hour, to manually diagnose the problem, bypass the faulty automation, and correct the DNS records directly. The machine failed catastrophically, the human saved the day, but only after those critical hours had already passed, letting the damage spread.
That's it exactly. The automation couldn't fix its own mess.
Okay, so that explains the root cause. Now let's talk propagation. Subsection 2.2, congestive collapse. How did that empty DNS record spread the pain?
Right. So the moment that empty DNS record for DynamoDB propagated within US-EAST-1, the service became logically unreachable. Not physically down necessarily, but impossible to find via DNS for the vast, vast web of internal AWS services that depend on it. The consequences were immediate and systemic. This DNS failure basically crippled the management planes, the control systems, for essential services like EC2, compute, network load balancers, NLB, simple query service, SQS, and many others. All of these rely heavily on DynamoDB for their own state management, configuration, and metadata.
Let's dig into that EC2 failure specifically, because that seems like the critical step in the propagation chain. How does a database DNS failure actually prevent someone from launching a simple virtual machine, an EC2 instance?
Yeah, this reveals a really critical internal dependency that honestly, most customers never see or even think about. Launching an EC2 instance relies heavily on an internal system called the Droplet Workflow Manager, or DWFM. Now, a droplet is AWS's internal term for a physical server unit, like a blade in a rack. DWFM is responsible for managing the state and lifecycle of these physical servers. It does this using a complex lease system. Essentially, a physical server has to have an active lease managed by DWFM before an EC2 instance can be placed onto it. And guess what DWFM relies on to perform its state checks and maintain the integrity of those crucial leases?
Let me guess. DynamoDB.
Bingo. DynamoDB. So when DynamoDB became unreachable due to the DNS failure, DWFM started failing its state checks. It couldn't establish new leases, it couldn't renew existing leases, it couldn't verify the status of droplets. Consequently, when customers or even internal AWS services requested new EC2 instances, DWFM simply couldn't find and assign a physical host with a valid verified lease. This is what triggered the system to return those misleading insufficient capacity or request limit exceeded errors back to customers, even though there might have been plenty of physical servers sitting idle. The entire supply chain for provisioning new compute had just ground to a halt because of a dependency on DynamoDB's DNS.
So the region was effectively paralyzed. It wasn't just that applications running on EC2 were failing because they couldn't reach DynamoDB. The fundamental ability to provision new EC2 instances, the very thing you need to do to mitigate an outage by scaling up or replacing failed instances, that itself was blocked by this control plane failure. That's brutal.
It's absolutely brutal. And this failure then cascaded further into the networking layer. There's another internal system, the network manager, which is responsible for propagating network state, like security group rules and routing information, for newly launched EC2 instances. Well, since DWFM was failing all the EC2 launch requests, the network manager's queue just got completely clogged with failed requests and unprocessed state changes. It accrued this massive backlog. So much later in the recovery window, when EC2 launches finally started succeeding intermittently, those newly launched instances often suffered connectivity problems because the network manager was so far behind in propagating the required network state. It just prolonged the crisis for those lucky enough to get an instance.
And then came the retry storm, the self-inflicted wound, as you called it, that seems to have maintained that monestable state for those agonizing 15 hours. The sources really emphasize that millions of simultaneous automated retries just amplified the failure. This is where the automation, which is supposed to help, truly became the enemy, right?
Absolutely. This is the paradox of automation in complex failures. The standard automated retry mechanisms, things like exponential backoff, adding jitter to delays, they are designed for transient, localized failures. They completely failed to handle the severity and the systemic nature of this region-wide control plane collapse. Instead of gracefully backing off and waiting for recovery, millions of dependent clients, both external customer applications and internal AWS services, just hammered the control plane endpoint simultaneously. They were desperately trying to resolve the DynamoDB DNS name or check some state that depended on it. This flood of retries pushed internal systems like those SQS queues managing workflows way past their saturation points. The internal network fabric itself suffered what amounted to a massive self-sustaining denial of service attack, generated by its own components trying to recover.
And the most telling detail, I think, about the failure of the system's own automation to cope is the necessity of that manual intervention we talked about earlier. The fact that AWS engineers were forced to apply manual throttling, they had to deliberately rate limit new EC2 launch requests and put caps on the work requests going into DWFM just to dampen the incoming traffic flood and try to guide the system out of that municipal failure state. Doesn't they suggest a pretty profound deficiency in the native internal circuit breakers or back pressure mechanisms that should have kicked in automatically?
It raises a critical and probably uncomfortable question about the limits of even the most sophisticated automation. In theory, yes, a system this complex should have automated circuit breakers, load shedding mechanisms, ways to prevent this kind of self-immolation. The fact that experienced SREs had to manually intervene, to essentially hit the brakes hard and starve the system of work requests to allow it to catch its breath, Well, it strongly indicates that the existing automated guardrails were likely designed and tuned for component failures, maybe single AZ failures, but not for this kind of systemic region-wide logical control plane failure driven by a subtle concurrency bug. The human hand, applying simple constraint, was required where complex automation had failed and was making things worse. That perhaps is the deepest and most humbling lesson of October 2025 for cloud providers.
It's a sobering thought indeed. Okay, let's move to section 3, the systemic flaw. And the big one here is US-EAST-1 acting as a single point of failure, or SPOF. Let's start with subsection 3.1, the failure of isolation boundaries. The absolute foundational promise of AWS resilience is the availability zone, the AZ. They're designed to be physically isolated, separate power, separate cooling, separate networks, located miles apart sometimes. Yet in October 2025, workloads across all 6 AZ in US-EAST-1 failed completely. For architects out there who meticulously design their systems across multiple AZs relying on this boundary, this has to be the most alarming part of the entire incident. Why did that fundamental AZ redundancy just evaporate?
Yeah, this is absolutely the crux of the architectural flaw that the DynamoDB DNS incident laid bare. And you're right, AZs provide robust physical isolation. If a data center floods or a power grid fails in one part of Northern Virginia, typically only that specific AZ goes down and workloads fail over to other AZs. That usually works. However, this DNS failure wasn't physical. It was a logical region-level outage. It stemmed from shared, centralized control mechanisms that spanned all the AZs. Think about it. The regional DynamoDB DNS endpoint, dynamodb.us-east-1.amazonoz.com, is a singular logical surface. It's shared across all 6 AZs in US-EAST-1. All workloads, regardless of which physical building or zone they happen to reside in, ultimately have to resolve that same logical endpoint to talk to DynamoDB in that region. So when that shared logical component failed due to the TOC-TSEU bug propagating that empty record, it simply didn't matter that the physical AZs were perfectly fine and isolated. The shared logical control plane component was corrupted, and that simultaneously locked out workloads in all 6 zones from accessing a critical service.
Wow. So if I was, say, a banking customer and I had diligently followed best practices, deployed my critical application across 3 AZs within US-EAST-1, maybe using Route 53 health checks for failover within that region, I was still 100% exposed to this failure. My application servers might have been running fine in their separate AZs, my data plane was maybe okay for a bit, but the regional control plane they relied on was toxic.
Precisely. That's exactly the scenario.
Yeah.
The post-incident analysis confirms it. Physical separation, while absolutely necessary, is critically insufficient with the logical control plane, the system's managing state, identity, networking configuration, DNS resolution for core services are centralized at the regional level. This incident fundamentally redefined the threat model. Multi-AZ within a single region doesn't protect you from region-wide logical failures.
Okay, that leads directly into subsection 3.2, control plane centralization and global paralysis. The technical sources seem to confirm that the ultimate global single point of failure, the reason this wasn't just a US-EAST-1 problem, was the historical centralization of core AWS global control planes in US-EAST-1 in Northern Virginia. It's the original region, the oldest, the biggest, and apparently it still holds the keys to the kingdom for certain global operations. We saw what the reports call a devastating architectural dependency inversion. Basically, the very mechanisms that were intended to help facilitate global resilience and failover actually became victims of the regional failure in US-EAST-1. Can we detail the key global functions that were paralyzed by this? I think the sources mentioned 3 major ones.
Yeah, the paralysis for anyone trying to manage a global footprint during this crisis was terrifyingly comprehensive. First, and perhaps the most critical one, was the IAM control plane, identity and access management. The sources confirm that the ability to create, update, or delete IAM roles and policies, the very foundation of your security and access controls, is globally anchored to the US-EAST-1 control plane. So imagine this scenario. You're a customer based in Frankfurt, Germany. You're running a mission-critical application primarily in the EU Central 1 region there. Suddenly, US-EAST-1 melts down, and maybe some secondary part of your global system is impacted. Or you just decide you need to initiate an emergency failover of some component to, say, AP Southeast 2 in Sydney, Australia, just to be safe or to reroute traffic. To do this failover, you might need to provision new infrastructure in Sydney, which probably requires creating temporary cross-region IAM credentials or maybe updating some IAM policies to grant permissions. Well, during this outage, you were completely unable to execute those required IAM configuration changes globally. Why? Because the central IAM control plane was down in Virginia. It effectively locked down crisis response efforts everywhere. The keys needed to unlock the failover capability were sitting inside the burning building, so to speak.
That is just the ultimate architectural vulnerability, isn't it? Your emergency response plan is completely predicated on the health of the very location that is currently failing. That's terrifying.
It's terrifying, exactly. Second major global function compromised. DynamoDB Global Tables Management. These are the features AWS offers for multi-region replication and synchronization, giving you global data consistency. Now, while the read data plane for global tables mostly remain functional, you can still read data from replicas in other regions. The management features, things like changing configuration settings, forcing synchronization checks, modifying replica regions, those rely on transactional endpoints located in US-EAST-1 for coordination and integrity. So customers who needed to reconfigure their global table settings during the outage to adapt. Blocked. And third, the operational SBOF that caused just massive customer frustration and confusion. AWS support operations. The entire system for creating and updating AWS support cases, the primary channel for enterprise support, its control plane relies entirely on US-EAST-1 availability. So during the absolute height of the crisis, when customers were desperate for information, guidance, updates, anything, the formal channel for getting enterprise support was completely non-functional. Customers worldwide couldn't create new cases, couldn't update existing ones. They were forced to rely on unreliable public channels like Twitter or scouring news reports. This severely hindered any structured enterprise crisis management and transparency from AWS's side through official channels.
The failure of the support system itself due to the failure of the underlying infrastructure it was designed to support. I mean, that's a masterclass in dependency mapping failure that I really hope every single cloud provider and major customer took to heart.
You'd certainly hope so. That highlights hidden dependencies.
And this brings us to subsection 3.3, implications for the cloud oligopoly. This incident seems like a harsh demonstration of what people call the shared fate risks inherent in this highly concentrated cloud market, right? AWS, Azure, GCP. They collectively control, what, 2/3 of the global market now?
Easily, yeah. And when the infrastructure is this concentrated, a single operational change, whether it's a human error pushing bad config, or in this case a faulty piece of automation triggered by a latent bug, the change can propagate globally in unexpected ways, completely bypassing those traditional geographical isolation boundaries we thought protected us.
And this immediately triggered a non-technical reaction too, didn't it? The regulatory conversation heated up instantly.
Absolutely. Regulatory bodies, particularly as we mentioned, the UK's Treasury Committee, responded incredibly rapidly. The central conversation shifted almost overnight from simply managing downtime better to actively discussing classifying AWS and similar hyperscale providers as critical third parties, especially to the financial services sector and national infrastructure. The potential financial and operational consequences of this single DNS bug were so severe that they moved directly into the realm of national security discussions and potential legal liability frameworks. Policymakers are now demanding significantly greater transparency from cloud providers, much better dependency mapping, and verifiable minimum resilience standards to manage this concentrated systemic risk. It's a whole new ballgame.
Okay, so that paints a pretty grim picture of the failure and its systemic nature. Let's look forward now. Section 4, the resilience roadmap. What needs to be done for prevention, and what are the architectural mandates, both for AWS and for customers? Let's start with 4.1, mandatory prevention for AWS. What are the non-negotiable technical and architectural fixes AWS absolutely must implement to prevent not just this specific failure, but the kind of systemic collapse it exposed?
Right, starting with the provider mandates. Technically, the first one is pretty obvious. They have to permanently fix that specific TTTQ race condition in the DNS and actor system. This isn't just about adding more checks. It requires implementing truly robust distributed synchronization mechanisms. We're talking about things like using atomic transaction controls or distributed locks across those redundant and actor nodes, something to guarantee that concurrent transactions cannot possibly overwrite newer valid state with older stale state. And alongside that, they absolutely must implement enhanced validation logic that actively prevents, rejects outright any configuration update that would result in a null or empty DNS record being published for such a critical service.
That should be unthinkable.
Okay, but fixing the specific bug is just remediation, right? It sounds like the sources are suggesting the real long-term solution requires a much bigger, more fundamental architectural commitment from AWS full decentralization. That is the strategic, multi-year, and probably incredibly expensive and complex mandate. Yes. AWS has publicly talked about this before, but this incident absolutely accelerates the need for their non-negotiable commitment to full cell-based architecture. This is a massive organizational and engineering effort. It involves breaking down critical global control plane infrastructure, like the central IAM management, the DynamoDB global table coordination, core networking configuration systems, into completely independent, vertically integrated silos or cells. The idea is if one cell fails due to a logical error or a bad deployment, the blast radius is contained only to the users or workloads specifically assigned to that cell. It should prevent a single failure in, say, the US-EAST-1 cell from ever again causing a region-wide or global outage of core control functions. This requires meticulously hunting down and eliminating all remaining hard dependencies on the original US-EAST-1 region for global control plane operations. And furthermore, alongside cell-based architecture, they have to aggressively decouple those internal management planes. We saw how EC2's lease management, DWFM, was tightly, synchronously coupled to DynamoDB's DNS health. Future architecture needs to introduce things like asynchronous communication patterns, robust caching with stale data tolerance, and graceful degradation pathways between these foundational internal services. The goal is to ensure that if one critical service like DynamoDB has a problem, other dependent services like EC2 provisioning can continue operating, maybe in a read-only or degraded mode, but still functional enough to prevent that complete congestive collapse we saw in October 2025.
Makes sense. Huge undertakings for AWS. Now let's flip it. Subsection 4.2, strategic imperatives for customers. What about us, the users of the cloud? The painful lesson, as we discussed, was that multi-AZ redundancy within a single region, even US-EAST-1, was totally insufficient protection against this kind of logical, region-level control plane failure. So what's the mandatory next step for anyone running truly mission-critical workloads?
Yeah, the takeaway for customers is stark. True multi-region architecture is no longer optional. It's mandatory for Tier 1, can't go down workloads. This forces you, as a customer, to deploy your application and its dependencies across at least 2 independent AWS regions. The goal is complete independence, ensuring that if US-EAST-1 becomes entirely toxic and unusable, your application can continue running completely unaffected in, say, US-West-2 in Oregon or EU-West-1 in Ireland. But this requires a very sober analysis of your required recovery objectives, because going multi-region is not free.
Right, let's talk about those trade-offs, specifically the recovery time objective, RTO, how fast you need to be back up, and recovery point objective, RPO, how much data you can afford to lose, because multi-region definitely adds cost and complexity, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And the sources emphasize that the specific multi-region pattern you choose directly dictates the cost and the operational complexity involved. You really have to choose based on your business's actual tolerance for downtime and data loss. The lowest cost entry point is typically the pilot light model. Here you run just minimal infrastructure, maybe the core database replicated, some base configuration in the recovery region. Most resources are off until needed. This aims for an RTO, a recovery time of maybe 30 to 60 minutes, potentially longer, as you have to spin everything up during the failover. A step up from that is warm standby. In this model, you maintain partial compute capacity and key services running, scaled down, in the second region. Data is usually replicated more actively. This can achieve a faster RTO, maybe in the 15 to 30-minute range. But the gold standard, the one that provides the highest survivability and, frankly, would have likely absorbed this October 2025 control plane failure almost seamlessly for the application itself, is the active-active architecture. Here, you operate full application capacity in both regions simultaneously. You use global services like Route 53 latency-based routing or AWS Global Accelerator to actively steer user traffic to the healthy region, or maybe load balance across both. Active has the highest ongoing operational cost and complexity, no doubt, but it provides a near-zero RTO for many failure scenarios, potentially absorbing even a full regional failure transparently to end users. In post-2025, many financial institutions and critical infrastructure clients are finding that regulatory pressure is essentially forcing them to justify the higher cost of true active resilience.
Okay, active sounds like the ideal if you can afford it. Now, given that the initial spark for this whole fire was a DNS failure, what are the mandatory steps customers should take to harden their own networking and DNS layer specifically?
Yeah, the lesson here is clear. Stop relying on a single DNS provider, even if it's your cloud provider's native service. Organizations running critical workloads must adopt a multi-provider DNS strategy. If you rely solely on Amazon Route 53 for your public DNS, you are inherently exposed to any large-scale AWS internal DNS failure or control plane issue, which is exactly what happened here in a way, though it was DynamoDB's internal DNS. A better approach is using Route 53 perhaps as your primary, but having a completely independent Anycast DNS provider configured as a secondary, or using traffic steering policies across both. This ensures that if the entire AWS control plane, including Route 53's management plane, has issues, your application's DNS resolution remains globally functional and reachable via the independent provider.
That makes a lot of sense. Diversify your dependencies. Now, maybe the single most critical lesson for actual recovery during an event like this, the one thing that seemed to differentiate between a customer who could maybe fail over gracefully versus one who was completely paralyzed, was how they handled that US-EAST-1 control plane paralysis. If IAM is offline, if support is offline, if you can't make changes, how do you actually execute the failover?
This is probably the key insight for architects from this entire event. You must architecturally and, just as importantly, operationally decouple your recovery process from the cloud provider's control plane. What does that mean? It means all the necessary recovery infrastructure, the IAM roles needed by your failover scripts, the security groups, the networking components like VPCs and subnets, and critically, the DNS records needed to point users to the recovery region. All of that must be fully pre-provisioned and awaiting in the recovery region before disaster strikes. Your failover scripts and automation must be meticulously designed to rely exclusively on the read-only data plane of global services where possible. For instance, checking the health of an endpoint data plane is usually fine, but creating a new DNS record or modifying an IAM policy control plane might fail catastrophically during a US-EAST-1 control plane crisis. You absolutely cannot, under any circumstances, design a recovery plan that relies on being able to create, update, or modify resources dynamically via control plane APIs during a major US-EAST-1 meltdown. You have to assume the central control plane is completely toxic and design your failover to avoid interacting with it entirely during the recovery execution phase. Pre-provision everything.
Pre-provision everything. That sounds like the mantra. And finally, operationalizing this resilience. Having great architectural diagrams is, frankly, useless if they aren't rigorously tested under realistic stress conditions, right?
100%. This is where mandatory chaos engineering practices become essential. It's not just a fancy buzzword anymore, it's a necessity. Organizations running critical systems must implement regular, mandatory practices, often in the form of quarterly game day drills that simulate targeted, realistic failures. This means going beyond just killing random servers. It means simulating a DNS black hole specifically targeting US-EAST-1 endpoints for your application. It means simulating the total loss of the central IAM control plane for an extended period. Can your team actually execute the failover using only pre-provisioned resources and read-only checks when they can't log into the AWS console or make API changes? These tests are crucial to validate the applications and the team's ability to survive the exact kind of congestive collapse and control plane paralysis that defined this prolonged October 2025 outage. It echoes models pioneered by companies like Netflix with their Chaos Monkey that applies into these more insidious logical failures. And as analysts like Gartner often point out, complexity is the enemy of uptime. For most organizations, rather than jumping to complex multi-cloud setups just for the sake of it, unless explicitly required by regulation, the better path to resilience is often maximizing your single cloud provider's resilience capabilities. That means investing heavily in robust, well-tested, potentially active architectures within that provider's ecosystem, focusing on true regional independence and control plane decoupling. That often provides better actual uptime and simpler operations than juggling multiple clouds poorly.
Focus on doing multi-region right within one provider before tackling multi-cloud complexity. Makes sense.
Exactly. Master the fundamentals first.
All right, let's try to wrap this up. We're heading towards the outro. Any final synthesis on what this deep dive really confirmed?
Yeah, I think this deep dive into the DynamoDB DNS incident really confirms, maybe more clearly than ever before, that complexity inherently breeds fragility in these modern hyperscale systems. We've meticulously analyzed how a single latent concurrency bug, which probably sat dormant for years, could be triggered and then amplified by internal dependencies. How it pushed a critical region like US-EAST-1 into that self-sustaining metastatic state that lasted for an excruciating 15 hours. The failure just underscores, I think, that the logical control plane, those centralized systems managing identity, configuration, DNS, state often anchored historically in a single region like US-EAST-1 for consistency reasons, represents the modern internet's most vulnerable Achilles heel. A single configuration flaw, a single bug in the automation there, can truly paralyze global systems that depend on it. So the path to genuine fortitude, to real resilience, it requires both the cloud providers and us as customers to fundamentally change our mindset. We have to stop assuming uptime is just guaranteed by magic. Instead, we need to make serious, non-negotiable investments in building. And, more importantly, testing. Truly decentralized, preferably active architectures. Architectures that prioritize logical isolation at the regional level, ensuring that the critical control plane functions can survive the inevitable failures of the data plane or other components.
A shift from assuming resilience to actively engineering improving it. So, what does this all really mean for us, for the people listening? I keep coming back to this. The sources are crystal clear that the most sophisticated, most automated cloud platform on the planet still needed humans, SREs, working in the middle of the night, 2.0 AM PDT, to manually apply critical fixes and, crucially, to manually throttle their own systems just to recover from that metastable state. The automation failed spectacularly, and a person had to intervene to basically save the digital economy. So here's a final provocative thought for you to mull over. The next time you're reviewing your disaster recovery plan, maybe for your company's most mission-critical workload, ask yourself this really hard question. If the centralized control plane for your identity, IAM, your networking configuration, and even your provider's support system went completely offline, globally inaccessible for half a day, could your documented failover process actually execute? Could it rely only on pre-configured, read-only infrastructure and data plane checks to get you back online, completely bypassing any need to create or modify a single resource via those dead control plane APIs? Really think about that dependency. Something to mull over. Thanks for tuning in to InfoSec Bytes. Keep exploring our 100-plus episodes on information security, AI, cloud, quantum, and cybersecurity incident root cause analysis. Like, subscribe, and share to stay connected and keep your cyber defenses strong.